Episode 20, Frequency 3. The Strength in Not Needing to Win. Reasonauts. Welcome back to Human Velocity X. My name isn't important. The message is. And before we begin, every day is awesome. We just have to get through it. If these conversations have been helping you navigate life a little differently, subscribe and stay with us each week. Share this with someone who's been carrying more weight than they let people see. And if you ever want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Facebook too. Not for attention, not for arguments, just a place where people can keep exploring the signal beneath the noise. Now, I want you to think about something. How much of your life have you spent trying to be understood? How many conversations, arguments, debates, explanations were never actually about the topic? They were about something deeper, the need to win. Most people think winning is obvious. Sports, games, competitions, contests, scoreboards tell the story. There's a clear outcome, a clear winner, a clear loser. But some of the strongest competitions in human life never happen on a field. They happen quietly, inside conversations, inside relationships, inside disagreements, inside identity itself. You've probably felt this before, that strange moment when a discussion stopped being about understanding and quietly became about victory. Nobody announces it. Nobody says, okay, now we're competing. But something in the atmosphere changes, the energy tightens, the listening fades, curiosity disappears, and suddenly people stop exploring ideas together. They start positioning, defending, justifying, protecting, building arguments, protecting identities, protecting beliefs, protecting self-image. And now the goal is no longer clarity. The goal is survival. Because once identity feels threatened, many people stop asking, what's true? And start asking, how do I avoid losing? That shift happens everywhere, in marriages, families, friendships, workplaces, politics, religion, social media, even inside our own minds. And what makes it difficult to recognize is that it rarely looks like competition on the surface. It often disguises itself as conversation, as concern, as explanation, as certainty. But underneath, something else is happening. People are fighting to preserve a version of themselves, a belief, a role, a story, an identity. And once you learn to see that shift, you can't unsee it. Because suddenly, you begin recognizing that many arguments were never really about facts. They were about ownership, status, safety, control, belonging, the invisible things human beings protect when they feel exposed, and awareness notices that quickly. It notices the moment understanding leaves the room and winning quietly takes its place. That's where this journey begins. Not with learning how to win more, but learning how often the need to win changes what could have become understanding. The need to win usually isn't about the topic. That's one of the most important things aware people eventually realize. People think they're arguing about facts, politics, parenting, money, religion, relationships, decisions, opinions. But underneath the topic, there's usually something deeper: identity, belonging, worth, competence, security. The things human beings build themselves around. Because once a person attaches themselves to a belief, a challenge to the belief can start feeling like a challenge to the self, and the nervous system reacts accordingly, not with curiosity, with defense. That's why two people can hear the exact same information and respond completely differently. One person becomes curious, the other becomes reactive. One asks questions, the other starts building arguments. One explores, the other protects, and often, the difference isn't intelligence, it's attachment. How much of their identity is sitting underneath the belief being challenged? Because when identity becomes fused to an idea, disagreement stops feeling intellectual, it starts feeling personal. Now the nervous system hears, if this is wrong, what does that mean about me? And suddenly, the conversation isn't about truth anymore, it's about safety. That's why some people can discuss difficult ideas calmly, while others experience disagreement almost like danger. The conversation itself isn't threatening. The identity attachment is, and awareness notices that quickly. You can feel the moment someone stops exploring reality and starts protecting themselves from it. Their tone changes, their curiosity narrows, their questions disappear, their need to be right grows stronger, and the atmosphere shifts because now the goal is no longer understanding. The goal is preservation. Preservation of identity, preservation of certainty, preservation of emotional stability. And honestly, we all do this sometimes. Every human being has beliefs they hold tightly, ideas they protect, stories they struggle to question. The difference is whether we notice it, whether we can catch ourselves in the act, whether we can recognize the moment we stopped searching for truth and started defending comfort. That awareness changes everything. Because once you can see that process inside yourself, you begin seeing it everywhere. And suddenly, winning starts looking less important than understanding why the need to win appeared in the first place. The need to win creates a hidden burden. Most people don't notice it at first because winning feels productive. It feels righteous. It feels like strength. It feels like standing up for truth, but over time, something begins happening underneath. Every disagreement becomes pressure. Every misunderstanding becomes a battle. Every contradiction becomes something that must be corrected. Every conversation becomes a potential contest, and eventually, life becomes exhausting. Because now you're no longer simply interacting with people, you're preparing for them. Anticipating objections, building responses, defending positions, managing outcomes, protecting conclusions. You stop having exchanges, you start having contests, and contests require energy constantly. Even when nobody else realizes a competition is taking place, your nervous system does. It stays activated, alert, ready, prepared to defend, prepared to justify, prepared to prove. And after enough years of that, people become tired in ways they struggle to explain. You leave conversations drained, not because the discussion was difficult, because your body treated it like combat. Not physical combat, psychological combat, identity combat, atmospheric combat. The exhausting work of needing to prevail. And that weight becomes even heavier for aware people, because awareness often sees more than one side at the same time. You can see why a person believes what they believe. You can see their history, their fears, their motivations, their blind spots. You can see the truth they're touching and the truth they're missing. You can see complexity. And once you see complexity, winning becomes harder to justify because reality rarely fits neatly inside victory and defeat. Most human situations contain layers, context, contradiction, competing needs, unresolved pain, partial truths, and awareness starts noticing that many arguments aren't actually battles between right and wrong. They're collisions between different experiences, different fears, different interpretations of the same reality. That realization changes people because eventually you begin asking, what am I actually trying to win here? The argument? The understanding? The relationship? The truth? Or simply relief from the discomfort of disagreement? And sometimes, that question reveals something surprising. The need to win was costing more energy than the disagreement itself. And once you see that clearly, the nervous system begins looking for something deeper than victory. It begins looking for coherence, for understanding, for peace that doesn't require someone else to lose first. There's usually a moment, not dramatic, not loud, not the kind of realization that changes everything instantly, just a quiet shift, a subtle recognition. You're explaining something carefully, clearly, patiently, trying to build understanding, trying to reduce confusion, trying to bridge the gap, and then suddenly, you notice something. They're not actually listening for understanding. They're listening for confirmation or validation or reassurance or emotional protection. They're waiting for reality to agree with them, not exploring reality itself. And in that moment, something shifts inside you because you realize winning this conversation will not change the outcome. Winning the argument will not create readiness. Winning the point will not automatically create growth. Even if they concede, even if they agree, even if you somehow prove everything perfectly, nothing meaningful changes until readiness exists, and suddenly, the entire contest loses its attraction. That's a strange moment for aware people because for years, part of your nervous system may have believed If I can just explain it clearly enough, if I can just find the right words, if I can just make them understand. But eventually, life teaches something deeper. Understanding cannot be forced. Agreement is not transformation. Compliance is not integration. And being right does not automatically create change. That realization is strangely freeing, because now you stop carrying the responsibility for everybody else's awakening. You stop feeling compelled to win every misunderstanding. You stop treating conversations like opportunities to secure a verdict, and instead, you begin paying attention to something more important: capacity, readiness, openness, the emotional conditions required for truth to actually take root. Because eventually you realize the goal was never to win the conversation. The goal was understanding, and if understanding is not available in that moment, winning becomes irrelevant. That's when something profound happens. Your nervous system relaxes, not because you stopped caring, because you stopped confusing victory with transformation. And once you experience that shift, you begin discovery, a different kind of freedom. The freedom of no longer needing every conversation to end with you being understood, validated, or proven right. Sometimes the deepest peace arrives the moment the contest no longer interests you. You know people like this. We all do. People who need to be right, not occasionally, constantly. Every discussion becomes proof. Every disagreement becomes a threat. Every correction becomes personal. Every conversation slowly turns into a courtroom. Evidence, defense, rebuttal, justification. And honestly, it can be exhausting to be around. Not because they're bad people, not because they're unintelligent, because certainty has become emotional armor. That's what awareness eventually notices. For some people, being right isn't just a preference. It's protection, a shield, a survival strategy, a way of maintaining stability in a world that feels uncertain underneath. Because if they stop being right, they fear becoming vulnerable. If they admit uncertainty, they fear losing authority. If they acknowledge they were wrong, they fear what else might unravel afterward. That's deeper than intellect, that's emotional protection. And once you start seeing that, something interesting happens. Compassion often begins replacing frustration, not because the behavior becomes healthy, because you finally understand what's driving it. You stop arguing only with the position. You start recognizing the fear underneath it, the insecurity, the uncertainty, the emotional vulnerability being defended by certainty. And suddenly, the conversation looks different, because now you realize some people are not protecting ideas, they're protecting themselves. The idea just happens to be where the defense is currently stationed. That awareness changes how you respond. You stop taking every disagreement personally. You stop feeling compelled to defeat every argument. You stop confusing resistance with malice, because sometimes resistance is simply fear wearing confidence as a costume. And honestly, the more aware you become, the more you realize that many of the loudest certainties are often standing guard over the deepest insecurities. That doesn't mean you excuse distortion. It means you stop being surprised by it. You begin understanding that the need to be right is often less about truth and more about safety. And once you see that clearly, the argument itself starts losing some of its emotional charge, because now, instead of seeing an opponent, you see a human being trying very hard not to feel exposed. You've probably lived this before. Maybe more than once. Maybe more times than you can count. A conversation starts small, something simple. A misunderstanding, a frustration, a disagreement, nothing major, at least not at first. But somewhere along the way, something shifts. The atmosphere changes, the curiosity disappears, and suddenly, nobody is listening anymore. Both people are building cases, both people are collecting evidence, both people are preparing responses instead of receiving information. And what makes it so tragic is this: both people are usually trying to be understood. A husband trying to explain himself, a wife trying to explain herself, a parent trying to be heard, a child trying to be seen, a friend trying to communicate pain, another friend trying to defend intent. And underneath all of it, both people are hurting. Both people feel unseen. Both people feel misunderstood. Both people feel vulnerable, but vulnerability quickly becomes defense, and defense becomes competition. The volume rises, the defensiveness grows, the distance expands, and eventually, someone wins. The point gets proven, the facts get established, the argument gets settled, the evidence lands, the logic holds, the verdict arrives, and yet the room feels colder because something else was lost: connection, trust, safety, goodwill, the feeling of being on the same side. And suddenly the victory feels strangely empty because the relationship paid for a prize that wasn't worth the cost. That realization changes people, especially aware people, because eventually you stop measuring conversations by who was right. You start measuring them by what survived afterward. The relationship, the trust, the openness, the possibility of future honesty, and you begin asking different questions. Not, can I win this? But will winning actually help this? That question alone can transform entire relationships, because some conversations are not asking for victory, they're asking for understanding, they're asking for witness, for empathy, for safety, for enough openness that truth can enter the room without immediately becoming a weapon. And understanding often requires something stronger than being right. It requires humility, the willingness to pause, the willingness to listen, the willingness to ask, what am I missing? Even when you believe you're correct, because sometimes the strongest person in the room isn't the one who wins. It's the one who protects the relationship while still protecting the truth, not sacrificing honesty, not sacrificing connection, holding both. And that's difficult, much harder than winning. Anyone can escalate, anyone can defend, anyone can prove a point. But it takes maturity to remain grounded enough to protect understanding while truth is being discussed. That's where wisdom lives. That's where relationships survive. And often, that's where real growth begins. This is where awareness matures again. Not when you learn how to argue better. Not when you become more persuasive, not when you gather better evidence. Awareness matures when you learn something much harder. Sometimes you can be right and still let the point go. That sounds simple, until you actually have to do it. Because part of the nervous system still wants resolution, still wants acknowledgement, still wants the other person to say, you were right. Still wants the misunderstanding corrected, still wants the truth recognized. But eventually, something shifts. You realize that holding on to the point is costing more energy than releasing it. Not because the truth stopped mattering, because your peace matters too. Not false peace, not suppression, not avoidance, not pretending reality changed. Real peace, the kind that comes from knowing, I no longer need this outcome to validate me. That realization is powerful, because now your identity is no longer tied to whether another person agrees. Your worth is no longer dependent on being acknowledged. Your stability is no longer attached to winning the exchange. And suddenly, you become free in a way most people never experience. You can speak honestly without needing control. You can share truth without demanding acceptance. You can offer perspective without attaching your peace to the outcome. That's strength, not weakness. Weakness often needs victory. Weakness needs confirmation. Weakness needs the scoreboard, needs the verdict, needs the other person to surrender. But strength can survive without it. Strength can tolerate ambiguity. Strength can remain grounded while someone disagrees. Strength can walk away without carrying the argument home. And honestly, that may be one of the most overlooked forms of emotional maturity. The ability to know you could keep arguing, you could keep proving, you could keep defending, and consciously choose not to. Not because you gave up, because you graduated. You realize that not every point is worth the cost of carrying it. And once you experience that, something inside you relaxes. The nervous system stops treating every disagreement like a test of identity. The need to win begins dissolving, and what remains is something quieter, something stronger. The freedom to remain aligned without requiring the world to agree with you first. There's something else. Aware people eventually discover. Reality is teaching all the time, even when nobody is speaking, even when nobody is explaining, even when nobody is trying to learn. Reality keeps teaching. Consequences teach, patterns teach, experience teaches, pain teaches, time teaches, relationships teach, success teaches, failure teaches. Life is constantly revealing things to anyone willing or forced to see them. And sometimes, that realization changes everything, because you begin noticing how many lessons arrived in your own life without anyone successfully explaining them to you first. You had to live them, feel them, carry them, experience them. Only then did they become real. And suddenly you understand. Other people are often walking the same path, not your path, their timing, their lessons, their consequences, their realizations, and life is already working on them. Even when it looks like it isn't. Even when they seem oblivious. Even when they keep repeating the same pattern. Reality has a way of introducing itself eventually. Not always quickly, not always gently, but eventually. And once you truly understand that, you stop forcing conclusions. You stop trying to accelerate awakenings. You stop feeling responsible for dragging people toward realizations they are not ready to hold yet. You stop confusing urgency with wisdom, because now you recognize something deeper. Growth has timing, awareness has timing, integration has timing, and forcing a lesson early does not guarantee understanding. Sometimes it only creates resistance. So you begin allowing reality to do what reality does, reveal through consequence, reveal through repetition, reveal through contrast, reveal through experience, reveal through the quiet accumulation of moments that eventually become undeniable. And honestly, there's a strange peace in that, because now your nervous system no longer feels responsible for being everybody else's teacher. You can still speak, still guide, still share what you see, but you no longer carry the impossible burden of making another person arrive. You trust the process more. You trust reality more. You trust that truth does not depend entirely on your ability to deliver it. Because some lessons belong to words, and some lessons belong to life. And life is often speaking much louder than any of us realize. This one hits deep, because sometimes the need to win isn't really about the argument at all. Sometimes it's about appearance, the need to appear intelligent, to appear informed, to appear competent, to appear capable, to appear like you know what you're doing. And honestly, a lot of people spend enormous amounts of energy managing perception, not just online, everywhere. They want to look smart, look successful, look knowledgeable, look certain, look like they have the answers. And the pressure to maintain that image can become exhausting. Because now every conversation feels like an evaluation, every question feels like a test, every disagreement feels like exposure, every mistake feels dangerous, and before long, learning becomes difficult. Because learning requires something the ego often hates: not knowing, being wrong, changing your mind, admitting uncertainty. That's why awareness eventually discovers something profound. Real intelligence doesn't need constant demonstration. It doesn't need every room to acknowledge it. It doesn't need every conversation to end in victory. It doesn't need to dominate discussions. It doesn't need the last word, because truly intelligent people usually understand something important. The goal is not to appear knowledgeable. The goal is to become more accurate, and those are not the same thing. One protects image, the other pursues growth. One performs certainty, the other remains open to correction. One needs validation, the other needs understanding. And once that realization settles in, something becomes lighter. You stop performing intelligence. You stop needing to prove that you belong in every conversation. You stop defending every opinion like it's part of your identity, and suddenly you become free again. Free to ask questions, free to say, I don't know. Free to reconsider, free to adjust, free to evolve, free to discover that changing your mind isn't a failure of intelligence, it's often evidence of it. Because growth requires flexibility, and flexibility requires humility, and humility requires enough confidence to survive being wrong. That's the paradox. The people most desperate to appear intelligent often struggle to learn. And the people most willing to learn rarely need to prove how intelligent they are. That's growth. Not knowing everything, remaining open enough to keep becoming. There's another layer to all of this. Modern culture rewards winning. Not necessarily truth, winning. The loudest voice, the sharpest comeback, the perfect response, the public takedown, the viral moment, the clip that spreads fastest, the quote that gets shared most. Entire systems are built around it. People collect attention through conflict. Algorithms reward outrage. Audiences reward certainty. Crowds reward confidence. And slowly, something subtle begins happening. People stop speaking to understand one another. They start performing for spectators. The goal shifts no longer what is true, but Who looked stronger? Who sounded smarter? Who got the better line? Who won the room? That's a dangerous shift because spectacle and truth are not the same thing. Performance and wisdom are not the same thing. Attention and understanding are not the same thing. Yet modern systems blend them together constantly. And if you're not paying attention, it becomes easy to mistake visibility for validity. You've noticed this before. The person dominating the room isn't always the person seeing clearly. The person speaking most confidently isn't always the person thinking most deeply. Sometimes they're simply the person most comfortable with attention, most comfortable with certainty, most comfortable being watched. Meanwhile, the person quietly observing, asking questions, considering complexity, and weighing consequences often gets overlooked entirely because crowds naturally measure what they can see: volume, confidence, speed, charisma. But wisdom often moves differently. Wisdom pauses, wisdom questions itself, wisdom tolerates uncertainty, wisdom takes longer, and those qualities rarely create viral moments. Awareness eventually learns this. It learns not to confuse visibility with coherence, not to confuse applause with accuracy, not to confuse attention with understanding. Because once you see that distinction, your relationship with truth changes. You stop chasing applause, you stop chasing validation, you stop needing witnesses for every realization. You stop measuring your understanding by how many people agree with you, and something becomes quieter inside. The nervous system relaxes. Because now your relationship with truth is no longer dependent on audience participation. You no longer need the crowd to confirm what you see. You no longer need a scoreboard to justify your perspective. You no longer need every realization to become a public event. And honestly, that might be one of the most freeing moments in the entire journey. When truth stops being something you perform for others and becomes something you quietly live from within. Because crowds can measure attention, algorithms can measure engagement, audiences can measure popularity, but none of those things are reliable measures of coherence. And once you understand that, the noise loses some of its power. The stage becomes less important, the audience becomes less important, and what remains is something far more valuable: the ability to stay aligned, even when nobody is clapping. The strongest people I've met rarely seem interested in winning, at least not in the way most people imagine. They're not chasing victory in every conversation. They're not collecting arguments. They're not keeping score. They're not constantly trying to establish dominance. Instead, they seem interested in something deeper: coherence. Their words match their actions. Their values match their behavior. Their energy matches their message. What they claim publicly looks similar to how they live privately. And because of that, they don't spend much energy defending an image. They don't need constant validation. They don't need every room to recognize their intelligence. They don't need every disagreement to end in surrender. They're already aligned internally, and that internal alignment creates something powerful: a quiet confidence, not arrogance, not superiority, not dominance, stability. The kind of stability that comes from knowing who you are without needing the room to tell you. The kind of stability that can hear disagreement without experiencing collapse. The kind of stability that can learn, adapt, adjust, and grow without interpreting every correction as a threat. That's why truly coherent people often feel different to be around. There's less tension, less performance, less need to impress, less need to prove, because when someone is internally aligned, their energy stops leaking into constant self-defense, and awareness notices that immediately. You can feel the difference between confidence and compensation, between certainty and coherence, between someone trying to appear strong and someone who has become stable. Stable people move differently. They listen more, react less, observe longer, speak with greater intention, and perhaps most importantly, they can tolerate disagreement without needing to conquer it. Because stability doesn't require victory, it requires alignment. And alignment doesn't need every room to agree. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't need spectators. It doesn't need universal approval. Because coherence carries its own confirmation. The proof isn't found in how many people agree with you. The proof is found in whether your life, your actions, your values, and your words continue pointing in the same direction. And honestly, that's one of the quietest forms of confidence a person can develop. The ability to remain aligned without needing to be declared the winner. Because at some point, awareness stops asking, "How do I win this?" and starts asking, "Am I living it?" And that question changes everything. Let me ask you something, gently. Where in your life have you been spending energy trying to win something that no longer needs winning? An argument? A misunderstanding? A perception? A relationship? An old story? And deeper than that, what would happen if you actually won? If they finally agreed? If they finally admitted you were right? If they finally saw exactly what you see? Would your nervous system finally become peaceful? Or would it immediately begin searching for the next battle? Because sometimes the thing we're chasing isn't victory, it's relief. And those two things are not always the same. If you've ever found yourself exhausted from explaining, defending, proving, correcting, convincing, translating your intentions, or trying to make everyone understand what you already see clearly, there's nothing wrong with you. Awareness naturally wants alignment, it wants coherence, it wants truth and reality to move closer together. That's part of its nature. But maturity eventually discovers something deeper. Not every battle deserves participation. Not every disagreement deserves energy. Not every contradiction requires correction. Not every misunderstanding requires defense. And not every person is asking for the same thing you are. Some are seeking understanding. Some are seeking comfort. Some are seeking certainty. Some are simply seeking relief. And learning the difference changes how you move through the world, because eventually you stop feeling responsible for every distortion you encounter. You stop treating every disagreement as an assignment. You stop carrying every contradiction home. You stop measuring your success by how many people finally agree with you. And perhaps most importantly, you begin realizing your worth was never dependent on winning. Not in conversations, not in relationships, not in public opinion, not in social approval. You do not become more true because someone agrees, and you do not become less true because someone doesn't. That realization is incredibly freeing, because now your nervous system no longer needs constant confirmation, no longer needs every room to validate your perception, no longer needs applause to trust what it knows. And when that shift happens, something becomes quieter inside. You stop chasing validation. You stop chasing victory. You stop chasing universal agreement. You stop chasing the exhausting fantasy that everyone must eventually see things exactly as you do. And instead, you begin protecting something far more valuable: coherence. The alignment between your words, your actions, your values, and your life, because coherence travels with you. It doesn't depend on votes. It doesn't depend on popularity. It doesn't depend on audience participation. It remains intact, whether people celebrate it, question it, or completely misunderstand it. That's strength, not dominance, not superiority, not winning. Inner stability. The ability to remain grounded without controlling everyone around you. The ability to speak truth without needing ownership of the outcome. The ability to care deeply without becoming consumed by every reaction. That's the movement. That's the evolution. That's what happens when awareness stops searching for victory and starts cultivating coherence. When understanding becomes more important than applause. When integrity becomes more important than image. When peace becomes more important than proving. That's what happens when awareness no longer needs the crowd to trust itself. That is the reason our journey. Take a breath. Let the fight leave your shoulders for a moment. If you've been carrying battles lately, maybe not all of them belong to you anymore. Maybe some of them were inherited. Maybe some of them were habits. Maybe some of them were attempts to prove a worth that never needed proving in the first place. Dedicated to those who spent years trying to earn acceptance, trying to earn understanding, trying to earn a place they already deserve to occupy. And to those now discovering that peace often begins where the need to win ends. If this episode resonated with you, subscribe and stay with us each week. Share it with someone who's tired of carrying battles that no longer belong to them. And if you'd like to continue the conversation, you can find us on Facebook too. Not for noise, not for attention. Just a place for fellow Reasonauts learning how to move through life with a little more clarity and a little less conflict. Next time, we step into something deeply human. What happens when you begin outgrowing people? Not because you're better, not because they're worse, but because growth changes landscapes. And sometimes the hardest part of becoming is realizing you can't stay the same person and keep moving forward. Remember, every day is awesome. We just have to get through it. I'll see you in episode 21.